So after the end of the Mercury program, the next stage to come along was to develop a rocket and a capsule that would be able to carry 2 astronauts at the same time for extended periods of time in space. They wanted to see if they could get up to the length of time it would take astronauts to get from the Earth to the moon, do a mission, and then come back safely. Other considerations that went along with that were water and food supplies for the 2 astronauts. They were going to have to learn to make extravehicular walks, or the walks in space. That would verify the suitability of the spacesuit. They also had to evaluate the suitability of the rockets to be compatible with 2 humans in the capsule trying to operate that. Another function of the Gemini program was to dock with the second vehicle while orbiting the Earth, and that would be determining how they're going to successfully manage that part of the program when they needed to dock with the lunar lander that was already being developed by NASA to tow it, the space capsule, to the moon. So the Gemini program had an awful lot of work ahead of them. Evaluating the rockets, evaluating the space capsules, determining how man could manage in extended periods of times in weightlessness and in Earth orbit, managing extravehicular activities, or EVAs as they became known, and the kind of jobs that men would be able to perform with these bulky spacesuits on. Yep, so there was a challenge there. As they did with the Mercury program, the first 2 launchings were unmanned, and Gemini 3 was the first manned rocket and was flown by Gus Grissom, again from the Mercury program, and his co-pilot was Edward Young. And their primary objective was to evaluate the spacecraft, the worldwide tracking system that was put in place, orbit attitude and maneuver systems, control of re-entry flight path, this was going to be a first, and the landing point. So the spacecraft systems and spacecraft recovery were some of the main objectives of Gemini 3. There were a few changes made to the orbit to begin the natural orbital decay, which was a gradually slowdown of the orbit and the capsule, which was meant to facilitate entry into the Earth's atmosphere. Before re-entry, the white adapter section would be jettisoned from the capsule, and that's where they had their oxygen and water and all the environmental supplies for the astronauts, and that would expose their retro rockets and their heat shield. They would then turn the spacecraft around and have its face shield facing the direction of travel they're in, fire the retro rockets, slow themselves down, get into, and then begin their descent back into the Earth's atmosphere. Now came one of the critical parts of the Gemini program, and that was evaluating the means in which they were going to dock with another vehicle while orbiting the Earth. And they designed a specific vehicle for that. It was named Agena, after Beta Centauri, which is also known as Agena. And it would launch on a separate vehicle from the Gemini program prior to the Gemini mission following it. They would then have to get into the same orbit, catch up with one another, and begin their docking procedures. The first time this was attempted was in Gemini 8. The pilot was Neil Armstrong, and his co-pilot was David Scott. Another Atlas launched the Agena that was going to be used so that Armstrong could dock with that and practice some of the maneuvers that they were tasked to do. The Agena became known as the GATV, or the Gemini Agena Target Vehicle. When Neil Armstrong first docked with it, everything seemed fine, but about 27 minutes into their exercises, both vehicles began a very violent yaw and tumbling situation that they had a great deal of difficulty arresting and getting back under control. So Armstrong separated the Agena from Gemini 8. They had used up so much fuel that under NASA safety regulations they had to abort the rest of the mission and return back to Earth. We'll skip the next several missions and finish off with the final Gemini 12 mission that Buzz Aldrin and Jim Lovell. The objectives of this mission was to dock with the GATV and conduct 3 extra vehicle activities. And while docked with the GATV, they would use its fuel to carry out some of the maneuvers, orbital changes that were tasked for the astronauts. They also had 14 scientific, medical, and technological jobs to perform as well. The first EVA to take place had Buzz Aldrin standing on a seat with his upper body outside of the capsule. When he finished that, then his next EVA was tethered to an umbilical cord, and he wandered down a handrail that he had installed on the outside of the capsule, went over behind the adapter section where he had a panel there where he did about 19 other different tasks that were assigned on that. By the time Buzz Aldrin re-entered the space capsule, or they had spent about 2.5 hours in extravehicular activities. Now, every time they left the spacecraft and came back in, both astronauts had to wear their spacesuits the whole time. But when this capsule was sealed off, they could remove their space helmet and breathe the normal air. But before they went out to do the EVAs, they had to depressurize that whole system. So they both had to get their full spacesuit on, depressure the capsule, and then open up the hatch and get outside tethered and do what he needed to do, and then come back in and then replenish their atmosphere. And that atmospheric gases came from tanks that were stored in the adapter section that, of course, had to be released before they tried to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. So by the end, they had succeeded in evaluating exposure in a weightless environment for astronauts. They evaluated human compatibility with the equipment and the space capsule itself and the length of time that they were up orbiting around the Earth. They improved the methods of maneuvering and performing the various and yaw and roll maneuvers that they needed for the spacecraft, and they evaluated the task of docking with a second vehicle and using that vehicle's fuel in order to fire its own rockets and change orbital speeds and control maneuverability and the attitude of the spacecraft itself. And those all turned out to be very successful. The next session that came along was the Apollo missions. And again, this was the largest rocket that had been built by anybody at that time, at a total of 111 meters or 363 feet. So as with the Gemini and the Mercury missions before, there were some unmanned missions launched for Apollo. In fact, the first 5 were unmanned, but unfortunately in Apollo 1, Gus Grissom of the Mercury and Gemini program, Edward White, who also flew in the Gemini program, and a new astronaut, Roger Chaffee, died in a fire in the Apollo 1 capsule while it was on the launch pad. So now to review what consisted of the Saturn V Apollo rocket, we'll start at the very top. The very top had a launch escape system very similar to what the Gemini and Mercury programs used, but again it had to be a little bit larger because it was lifting a larger space capsule and lifting 3 men and all their stored supplies inside. And it was now called the command module. That was where the astronauts controlled the attitude of the rocket, they controlled a lot of the mechanisms, and they also maintained their communications with Earth and kept them up to date with what was happening. So they had the cone-shaped command module, and that was attached to a very long cylinder, barrel-shaped device that controlled the life support systems for the astronauts inside the space capsule. It also provided with them the fuel that would be used to propel the rocket if they need to make course changes on the way to the moon, getting themselves into orbit around the moon with the lunar excursion module attached to it. And then once the lunar excursion module had descended to the moon, the command module and service module continued to orbit with one pilot inside. And when their mission on the moon had finished, then half of the lunar excursion module would take off and reconnect with the space capsule, the command module, finish their orbit, and then the service module would be able to fire its main rocket and take them out of the lunar orbit they were in and put them on a trans-Earth path back to orbit into the planet Earth and eventually come down and land again. There were 4 missions that launched before Apollo 11 that landed on the moon. Apollo 7 and 9 orbited the Earth and practiced the docking procedures with the lunar excursion module. Apollo 8 and 10 orbited the moon. So they were able to leave Earth's orbit, make the transition over to moon, orbit there, and find their way back to Earth. Those missions went wonderfully successfully. The next mission was Apollo 11, and that's the one that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin piloted to the moon and landed on the lunar surface. So Apollo 11 and 12 were the first to orbit the moon and land and carried out successful missions. Apollo 13, and you've probably seen Ron Howard's movie called Apollo 13, it had a problem on its way to the moon, had an explosion in the service module, which again sits right behind the command module or the spacecraft, and they lost an awful lot of oxygen. So they had to abort their mission, but they couldn't just turn around and come back. They had to fly to the moon and use the lunar gravity to help slingshot them back to a trans-Earth return flight. The last 3 Apollo missions, 15, 16, and 17, all took with them a lunar rover, or for lack of a better term, a moon buggy. And they would drive that around the moon. It gave them a further extended range than what they had on foot. They were able to go and visit an awful lot of different locations and so on and so forth. In fact, Apollo 17 booked over 30 kilometers of travel on their lunar rover itself. But on one of the missions, the lunar rovers, all of them, all 3 had mesh kind of wheels. And they picked up an awful lot of dust. And that was anticipated by the engineers. So they put long round fenders over top of the wheels. And on one of the missions, one of the fenders broke. And it was propelling dust over both astronauts that were riding in the buggy. And the dust turned out to be quite abrasive to the spacesuits. And in concern that they would lose their integrity and cause problems for the astronauts, they decided they had to repair the fender. And this is the first time an automobile off of the planet Earth was repaired with duct tape. Duct tape. Don't leave home without it. Thank you for watching. Be safe, be smart, and take a break and get out to enjoy our night sky. I'm Breton Bailey, and thank you.